The wedding hall was silent except for the uncomfortable shifting of guests in their seats. All eyes fixed on the bride walking down the aisle in a dress that seemed too tight, her face flushed with shame. Daniel Chen stood at the altar, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with barely contained rage as he watched the woman approach, the woman his parents had chosen without his consent. At 28, Daniel was everything his family had groomed him to be. The heir to Chen Industries, Harvard-educated, with a face that had graced business magazines. But today he felt like a prisoner. His parents sat in the front row, his mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, his father's expression stern and unyielding, the same expression that had ended all of Daniel's protests 3 months ago. The bride, Emma Walsh, kept her eyes down as she reached the altar, her hands trembling as she held a simple bouquet of white roses, her breathing shallow and quick. Daniel's best friend Marcus had tried to talk him out of going through with it, had offered to help him run away, but Daniel knew the consequences. His father would disown him, destroy his career, ruin everything he'd worked for. Emma's parents stood on the other side, her mother crying softly, her father looking relieved that his daughter was finally being married off, finally becoming someone else's problem. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the hall, and Daniel spoke his vows like a man reciting a death sentence, each word tasting bitter on his tongue. When Emma spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, so soft that the priest had to ask her to repeat herself, and Daniel felt a flash of cruel satisfaction at her obvious discomfort. The reception was worse. Daniel refused to dance with his new wife, spent the entire evening drinking scotch at the bar while Emma sat alone at the head table, untouched cake in front of her. Guests whispered behind their hands, some pitying Emma, others calling Daniel heartless. But no one understood the fury burning in his chest, the feeling of having his entire life hijacked. When the night finally ended, they drove to Daniel's penthouse apartment in separate cars, Emma following behind in an old Honda that looked out of place in the luxury building's garage. Daniel's apartment was all glass and steel, overlooking the city skyline, a bachelor's paradise that now felt contaminated by the presence of this stranger. He was forced to call his wife. He showed Emma to the guest room without a word, pointed at the bathroom, and left her standing there with her small suitcase, her eyes still downcast. For the first month, they lived like hostile roommates. Daniel left before dawn and returned after midnight, leaving notes about bills and schedules instead of speaking to her directly. Emma kept the apartment spotless, cooked meals that Daniel never ate, and spent her days in the guest room, the door always closed, her presence almost invisible. Daniel's mother called constantly, asking about grandchildren, about whether Emma was adjusting, and Daniel would end the calls with increasingly creative excuses, his resentment growing with each conversation. At the office, Daniel threw himself into work with manic intensity, closing deals, expanding the business, anything to avoid going home to face the reality of his situation. His colleagues noticed the change. Marcus confronted him one evening, told him he was becoming someone else, someone cold and bitter. But Daniel just ordered another drink. It was on a Tuesday night, 6 weeks into the marriage, when everything began to shift in a way Daniel never expected. He came home earlier than usual, around 8, and heard sounds coming from his home office, the room he'd explicitly told Emma was off limits. Daniel's anger flared immediately. He stormed down the hall, ready to unleash weeks of pent-up frustration, but stopped dead when he saw what Emma was doing. She sat at his desk surrounded by papers, his quarterly report spread out before her, a calculator in one hand and a red pen in the other, completely absorbed in her work. Daniel was about to yell when he noticed the notes she'd written. Complex financial analyses, problem areas he'd been struggling with highlighted and annotated with solutions. Emma looked up, startled, her face going pale as she scrambled to gather the papers, stammering apologies. But Daniel held up his hand, his mind racing with questions. He picked up one of her annotated pages, studying her notes. They were brilliant, identifying inefficiencies in the supply chain he'd spent months trying to solve, with solutions so elegant he felt stupid for missing them. Daniel asked where she learned this, his voice sharp but curious, and Emma's response came quietly. She had a PhD in operations management from MIT, had worked as a consultant before her father's business failed. The next hour unfolded like a revelation. Emma explained that she'd been reviewing his work out of habit, couldn't help herself when she saw the reports on his desk, hoped he wouldn't be angry. Daniel sat down across from her, really looked at her for the first time since the wedding, and asked why someone with her credentials was living like a ghost in his guest room. Emma's story came out in halting sentences. Her father's company had collapsed 2 years ago, debts piling up, creditors threatening, and her weight had spiraled as depression took hold. The marriage arrangement had been her father's last desperate move. Chen Industries would absorb the debts, and Emma would marry the son, a transaction dressed up as tradition. She'd accepted because she had no choice, because her parents would lose everything, because she'd already lost herself and figured one more piece wouldn't matter. Daniel felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the wall of anger he'd built because he finally understood they were both prisoners, both sacrificed on the altar of family obligation. He asked if she'd be willing to help him with the Chen Industries expansion project, the one keeping him at the office until midnight, and Emma's eyes lit up for the first time since he'd known her. They worked together that night, and the night after, and soon it became their routine. Emma's insights proving invaluable, her mind sharp and creative in ways that amazed him. The project that had been floundering for months suddenly gained momentum. Daniel presented Emma's strategies to the board, claiming them as his own at first, until guilt made him credit her properly. His father called, suspicious about where these new ideas were coming from, and Daniel told him the truth, that his unwanted wife was the secret weapon Chen Industries never knew they needed. The silence on the phone was long. Then his father said something that surprised Daniel, that perhaps the arrangement had worked out better than anyone had planned. As weeks turned into months, Daniel found himself looking forward to coming home, to the evening strategy sessions that often included Emma's cooking, her shy smile when he complimented her analysis. He noticed other things too, how Emma had started taking walks in the morning, how she'd joined an online support group, how the weight was slowly coming off as she found purpose again. One evening, Marcus came for dinner, prepared to dislike Emma on principle, but left 4 hours later singing her praises, amazed by her knowledge and surprised by her quiet sense of humor. Daniel's mother visited and found Emma teaching her son to cook proper Chinese dishes, the kitchen filled with laughter, and she pulled Daniel aside with tears in her eyes, apologizing for forcing the marriage but grateful for the outcome. The Chen Industries expansion launched successfully. Stock prices soared, and the business press credited Daniel's innovative approach, but he made sure every article mentioned Emma's contribution. 6 months after the wedding, Daniel came home to find Emma standing in the living room, dressed for an evening out, 50 pounds lighter and glowing with newfound confidence. She told him she'd been offered a consulting position at a rival firm, excellent salary, her own team, and she wanted to know if he'd be okay with her taking it. Daniel felt panic rise in his throat, not because of losing her professional help, but because he'd grown accustomed to her presence, to their late-night conversations, to the way she challenged his thinking. He asked her to stay at Chen Industries instead, as a full partner, with equity and a seat on the board, and Emma stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Daniel realized he was offering her the position because it was smart business, but also because somewhere along the way the stranger he'd been forced to marry had become the person he most wanted to see every day. Emma accepted, but on one condition, that they sit down and have an honest conversation about their marriage, about what it was and what it could become and what it... That night, they talked until dawn. Daniel apologized for the cruelty of those first months, for treating her like an inconvenience instead of a person, and Emma forgave him with a grace that humbled him. She admitted that she'd gone into the marriage feeling worthless, that his initial rejection had hurt but also felt deserved, and Daniel felt ashamed of the pain he'd caused. They agreed to start over, not as strangers forced together, but as partners choosing to build something real, taking it slow, letting trust and affection develop naturally. The change didn't happen overnight, but gradually, the guest room became a home office and Emma moved into the master bedroom, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. Daniel's friends noticed the transformation. He smiled more, laughed easier, and spoke about Emma with obvious pride and affection that surprised everyone who knew the marriage's origins. The business thrived under their combined leadership. Emma's operational genius paired with Daniel's strategic vision, and Chen Industries became an industry leader, doubling in value within a year. Daniel's father, who'd arranged the marriage purely for business reasons, admitted at a family dinner that he'd accidentally gotten it right, that Emma was the daughter-in-law he'd hoped for, but never expected. On their first anniversary, Daniel took Emma back to the wedding venue, the same hall where they'd stood as strangers and renewed their vows with words they'd written themselves. This time, Emma walked down the aisle with her head high, her hand steady, her smile radiant, and Daniel's eyes never left her face, filled with genuine love and wonder. Marcus, serving as best man again, joked that he'd never seen a more dramatic plot twist, and the guests laughed, but they all understood the deeper truth beneath the humor. Emma gave a speech at the reception, thanking everyone for their support, and acknowledging that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best outcomes we never imagined. She looked at Daniel and said that being forced into marriage had felt like a prison sentence, but choosing to stay, choosing to love him, had set her free in ways she never expected. Daniel stood and told the room that he'd spent the first month of marriage feeling like a victim, but now understood that the real tragedy would have been missing the chance to know Emma. He admitted that his pride and prejudice had almost cost him the most important relationship of his life, and that he was grateful every day that Emma had the patience to wait for him to grow up. The evening ended with them dancing under the same chandelier where they'd stood a year ago. But everything had changed, the fear replaced with joy, the resentment transformed into devotion. 2 years later, Chen Industries launched the initiative Emma had designed, providing business consulting and mental health support to struggling entrepreneurs, helping others the way Emma wished someone had helped her family. The program became nationally recognized. Emma appeared on business shows and magazine covers, her story of transformation inspiring thousands who felt trapped by circumstances or their own limitations. Daniel often reflected on that wedding day, on how close he'd come to destroying something beautiful before it had a chance to grow, on how wrong his first impressions had been. He learned that worth isn't measured in appearance or circumstances, that the person you're forced to stand beside might be exactly the person you need, if you're brave enough to actually see them. Their story spread through their social circle, changing how people viewed arranged marriages, proving that even transactions could transform into love if both people chose to invest in growth and understanding. Emma never forgot the pain of those first months, but she also never let it define their marriage, instead using it as a reminder of how far they'd traveled together. They built a life based not on the obligation that brought them together, but on the choice to stay together, to build something meaningful from an arrangement neither wanted but both came to treasure. And on quiet evenings when they sat together reviewing business plans or simply talking, Daniel would remember the stranger in the too-tight dress and marvel at his own blindness, at how close he came to missing the greatest gift his parents ever gave him, even if they gave it for all the wrong reasons. Retry,